December 13th, 1943. 2,000 feet over Dinjan airfield, Assam, India. 1 P-40N. Warhawk facing 64 inbound Japanese aircraft, 24 Ki, 21 bombers, 40 Ki, 43 fighters, closing from 12 miles out. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was the only American airborne. 16 strikes had already torn through Lulu Bell. The right aileron was jammed. Control cables were failing. Luke field instructors had been clear about this scenario. Damaged controls meant immediate bailout. Adair did not reach for the canopy release. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was 24 years old, assigned to protect supply routes few Americans could locate on a map. The China-Burma-India theater did not carry the reputation of Europe or the Central Pacific. It carried tonnage, humidity, and long patrols over terrain that erased forced landings. Adair was not considered a standout pilot. His training record from Luke Field showed no disciplinary issues, no extraordinary commendations. Average, gunnery scores. Acceptable formation discipline, strong instrument work. Instructors marked him as technically attentive. It was not written as praise. He had spent more time studying aircraft manuals than socializing in the officers' quarters. Maintenance crews knew him by name because he asked questions about linkage tolerances, about cable routing, about control surface harmonization at different airspeeds. Pilots noticed. Some laughed. The P-40N Warhawk was already considered outdated by late 1943 standards. It lacked the climb rate of the latest Allied fighters. It could not outturn a Ki-43 Oscar. It was heavier in the nose, less forgiving at low energy states. The Warhawk required discipline. Many preferred newer airframes. Adair did not complain about the aircraft. He requested extra time and damaged control simulations during stateside training. On 2 occasions, he stayed after scheduled instruction to practice asymmetric handling on partial throttle and uneven trim. One instructor reportedly asked him why he cared so much about a scenario that ends in silk anyway. Silk meaning parachute. Adair did not answer. He grew up around farm machinery in the Midwest. Repair work preceded operation. When something failed, you did not abandon it immediately. You diagnosed, you improvised, you finished the task if possible. It was not philosophy, it was habit. At Dinjan airfield, his role was straightforward: patrol interception and base defense. The 89th Fighter Squadron rotated pilots through standing air cover when intelligence suggested bomber traffic over the Hump Supply Corridor. On the morning of December 13th, Adair happened to be airborne when radar and ground observers reported incoming formations. He was alone. There is no record of complaint in the squadron log. No remark that he was unsupported. The rest of the squadron was refueling and rearming after earlier sorties. The timing was procedural, not dramatic. Still, the arithmetic was not favorable. 64 aircraft approaching in layered formation. 24 Ki, 21 Sally, medium bombers, carrying sufficient ordnance to disable runways, fuel stores, and maintenance hangars. 40 Ki, 43 fighters tasked with escort and suppression. Their doctrine emphasized agility and aggressive vertical pursuit. Adair's assigned patrol altitude placed him between the incoming formation and Dinjan's runway grid. Some pilots, upon visual confirmation of those numbers, might have withdrawn to gain altitude and wait for reinforcement. That would have aligned with common survival calculations. Intercepting alone risked immediate encirclement. Adair turned toward them. Ground observers later noted that he did not dive recklessly. He maintained spacing, adjusted throttle gradually, and approached from a vector offset to the bomber's direct path. This was not bravado, it was geometry. There had been light remarks in the ready room weeks earlier. Someone once referred to him as the engineer. Another described him as careful to a fault. The implication was clear: care does not win dogfights. Aggression does. But aggression without calculation against a superior number becomes fuel for someone else's victory report. Adair's gunnery practice earlier that month had shown a measurable improvement in deflection shooting. No ceremony followed. It was recorded, then filed. That improvement would matter, though no one present could have predicted how. He had also studied Japanese climb profiles after escort separation. Intelligence briefings suggested that P-43 pilots favored tight vertical loops once engaged, trusting superior maneuverability at low speeds. Few American pilots tested those limits intentionally. Most avoided turning engagements altogether. Adair did not avoid studying them. There is one additional note in his file, dated November 28, 1943. Demonstrates above-average aircraft energy awareness. The phrase is understated. It implies that he understood the exchange between altitude, speed, and control authority, not as theory but as usable leverage. On December 13th, leverage was the only asset he possessed. He did not have numerical advantage. He did not have superior maneuverability. He did not have immediate support. What he had was altitude margin, knowledge of his aircraft's dive tolerance, and a runway behind him that could not absorb a full bomber strike. Dinjan's fuel reserves were exposed. Supply operations over the hump depended on that strip remaining functional. If the bombers reached release distance unopposed, the cost would extend beyond one airfield. Adair was aware of that calculus. He rolled slightly to align his approach vector. He did not radio a speech. He did not request confirmation. The transcript from that morning contains only position updates and altitude reports. He committed to intercept at a ratio of 1 to 64. That was not heroism. It was acceptance of timing. The formation continued inbound, and there would be no second chance at the first pass. The Japanese had not chosen Dinjan at random. Throughout late 1943, medium bomber formations had tested the airfield scattered across Assam. Some raids were probing runs. Others were deliberate attempts to sever the air bridge over the Himalayas. Each strike forced repairs. Each repair consumed manpower already stretched thin. The pattern was familiar. Ki-21 Sally bombers would approach at medium altitude in disciplined formation. Ki-43 Oscar fighters would climb ahead and above, clearing interception paths before Allied aircraft could establish position. If resistance appeared, the Oscars would descend aggressively, forcing defensive turns and isolating any pilot who overcommitted. The results were consistent. Interceptors often chased fighters. Bombers slipped through. Command reports from previous weeks noted damage to fuel storage and runway craters that delayed sorties for hours. In a theater dependent on continuous transport flights, hours mattered. The Japanese understood that. Conventional interception doctrine required numbers. Ideally, multiple P-40s would climb in staggered layers, drawing off escorts before making coordinated diving passes at the bombers. Speed from altitude was the advantage. Concentration of fire was the objective. But that doctrine assumed availability. On the morning of December 13th, the assumption failed. 64 aircraft inbound, 1 American fighter airborne. Dinjan's command staff did not have the luxury of forming a textbook response. Reinforcements would take time. Time the incoming formation was erasing mile by mile. The urgency was not abstract. At cruising speed, the Ki-21 formation would reach bombing distance in minutes. Once bombs were released, interception no longer protected infrastructure. It became retaliation. Previous attempts to break bomber formations head-on had produced losses. The Ki-21 was not defenseless. Defensive gunners were positioned to cover forward and lateral arcs. An isolated interceptor making a frontal approach risked concentrated fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. Turning engagements were worse. The KY-43 Oscar possessed lighter wing loading and superior low-speed maneuverability compared to the P-40N. Pilots who attempted to match the Oscar in horizontal turns often found themselves outpaced, outangled, and under fire within seconds. Reports described P-40s shredded during extended turning fights they could not win. Standard advice was clear: avoid turning contests, avoid isolation, maintain altitude superiority, engage only with support. But none of those conditions existed at 2,000 feet over Assam. The Japanese had also adapted. Earlier in the campaign, escort fighters sometimes remained close to bombers, prioritizing direct protection. By late 1943, tactics shifted. Oscars increasingly pushed outward, expanding the engagement envelope to intercept American fighters before they could line up attack vectors. The effect was psychological as well as tactical. Interceptors were forced to defend before they could strike. The pressure on Dinjan's command structure reflected that shift. Repeated raids had created an unspoken expectation. Interception must occur early and decisively. Allowing bombers to approach unchallenged was no longer acceptable, yet losses could not be sustained indefinitely. Aircraft were finite. Pilots were irreplaceable. The problem was mathematical and moral. Engage alone and risk immediate loss. Withdraw and risk infrastructure collapse. Previous solutions relied on formation strength. On December 13th, formation strength did not exist. Adair's position in the sky represented both opportunity and vulnerability. He was forward of the airfield. He had visual contact before the bombers reached release range. But he lacked mutual support. Once engaged, he would be surrounded. There was no precedent in the squadron logs for a single P-40 intercepting a formation of that scale unaided. The problem had not been rehearsed. It had been avoided. Some would later suggest that retreating to gain altitude might have bought time. That calculation ignored the escort screen. The Oscars were already maneuvering ahead of the bombers. Any visible climb would draw immediate attention. Altitude would not remain uncontested. The Japanese advantage lay in numbers, maneuverability, and layered doctrine. Dinjan's disadvantage lay in timing. Radio traffic that morning remained minimal. Ground control transmitted heading updates. There were no strategic debates. The urgency was assumed. The decision space was narrowing with every mile. Standard solutions, wait for reinforcements, coordinate crossfire, attack in sequence, were not available. And once Adair committed to intercept, disengagement would not be simple. The Oscars were trained to pursue relentlessly, especially against isolated targets. Alone, P-40 diving into formation would trigger a defensive spiral of fighters descending from multiple altitudes. The problem was not merely survival, it was whether a single aircraft could disrupt a bombing run sufficiently to force hesitation. Hesitation would break formation. Broken formation would delay release. Delay might save Dinjan, but hesitation required shock. Conventional approaches did not produce shock against superior numbers. They produced predictable resistance. The Japanese had studied American tendencies. They expected diving passes followed by extension. They expected the P-40 to avoid prolonged exposure. If Adair behaved predictably, the formation would absorb the attack and continue. The distance between the formations continued to shrink. 6 miles, 5. The bombers maintained course. The Oscars adjusted spacing, scanning for movement. The problem was now immediate, and whatever solution emerged would have to be executed alone. December 13, 1943. Late morning light. Over Assam. Visibility was clear but not sharp. A thin haze hung over the low hills beyond Dinjan. The Brahmaputra Valley below reflected a muted glare from scattered river channels and damp ground. Cloud cover was minimal, scattered high and thin, insufficient for concealment, sufficient to distort distance. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was already airborne when ground control confirmed the inbound formation. Fuel state was adequate. Ammunition was full. He had been conducting routine patrol at approximately 2,000 feet, lower than ideal for interception, but positioned between the airfield and the reported vector. There would be no second aircraft joining him before contact. This was his first completely isolated intercept against a large, organized formation. Previous engagements had involved at least one wingman. Even a distant ally changes decision-making. Alone, there is no correction for error. Adair adjusted the throttle gradually. He did not climb steeply. A rapid climb would silhouette him against the sky and attract the escort screen. Instead, he altered heading to approach from an offset angle, using relative positioning rather than altitude gain to generate surprise. The Japanese formation became visible in layered depth. Bombers in steady alignment. Escorts distributed in a loose forward arc, some higher, some lateral. The spacing indicated preparation for contact. They were not relaxed. Adair did not aim for the nearest fighter. He identified the lead bomber element. This decision was consistent with doctrine but difficult in execution. Escort fighters exist to punish that choice. Attacking a bomber formation without neutralizing fighters first compresses engagement time and increases exposure. Adair reduced throttle slightly to stabilize approach speed. Overspeeding into the formation would shorten firing window. Underspeeding would make him predictable. At approximately 1,500 yards, escort fighters began adjusting vector. They had seen him. He committed. The P-40's nose dipped into a shallow dive, increasing speed without steep angle. His aim was not to scatter the entire formation, but to disrupt the lead segment. A single bomber damaged early could force spacing changes. He opened fire within effective range. Short bursts, no extended spray. Tracers crossed the lead Ki-21's left engine nacelle. There was no visible explosion. There was smoke, thin at first, then darkening. The bomber maintained formation for several seconds, longer than expected. Adair did not linger to confirm outcome. He passed beneath the formation, adjusting rudder and trim to maintain exit vector. Defensive fire from the bombers was disciplined but brief. The element he struck began to drift, not dramatically, but enough to disturb alignment. That was sufficient. Escort fighters descended. Two Ki-43s rolled into pursuit from his left rear quadrant. Their angle of descent was aggressive, closing distance rapidly. Adair did not attempt to turn. Inside them, he extended forward, building speed. The P-40's structural tolerance and dive was superior to that of the Oscar. Adair knew this. It was a technical advantage, not a guarantee. He pushed slightly steeper, forcing the pursuers to choose between maintaining pursuit and preserving structural integrity. One continued. The other broke off earlier than expected. Adair leveled at low altitude, careful not to overcommit to ground proximity. Assam's terrain did not forgive miscalculation. Low hills, tree lines, uneven visibility, useful for brief masking, dangerous if misjudged. He initiated a gradual climb once separation distance stabilized. The Oscar that continued pursuit attempted a climbing turn to reestablish position. It gained angle briefly. Adair resisted the impulse to match turn rate. Instead, he reduced bank angle and preserved energy, allowing the pursuing fighter to overshoot slightly. The overshoot was marginal. Marginal was enough. Adair fired a controlled burst as the Oscar crossed his forward arc. No dramatic detonation followed. The Japanese fighter dipped, then began trailing light smoke. It did not fall immediately. It disengaged, descending toward the haze. Adair did not pursue. He regained altitude slowly, scanning. The bomber formation had adjusted spacing. The damaged Ki-21 was lagging, creating a visible gap in the forward alignment. The escorts were now more tightly clustered around the central bombers, abandoning some of their forward screen. That was the first measurable effect. One bomber compromised. One escort disengaged. The formation had not broken, but it had tightened, and tightening reduced flexibility. Adair checked instruments. Engine temperature stable. Ammunition reduced but sufficient. Fuel state acceptable for continued engagement. This first pass did not destroy the threat. It altered its shape. The Japanese had now confirmed his presence and capability. The next response would be calculated, and the window for improvisation was closing. The second approach did not resemble the first. The Japanese formation had adjusted. The bombers tightened spacing and reduced the visible gap left by the damaged Ki-21. Escort fighters redistributed into a layered defensive arc, 2 elements high, 2 flanking laterally, 1 trailing low to intercept diving attacks. The forward screen no longer drifted loosely. It waited. They had learned from the first pass. Adair climbed to re-establish position, but altitude advantage was now contested. 2 Oscars rose deliberately to match him, not aggressively, but with measured spacing designed to bracket rather than chase. This was no longer about surprise, it was about endurance. Standard procedure suggested disengagement at this stage. A lone interceptor against reinforced escort coverage risked encirclement. The bombers were still miles from release distance. Another pass would increase exposure time, without guarantee of additional disruption. But turning away meant surrendering the initiative entirely. Adair assessed geometry. The escort screen's adjustment revealed intent. Deny clean bomber access. Force the P-40 into a defensive turn, then collapse from above. The Oscars were not charging recklessly. They were preserving energy. That was new. Adair did not dive immediately. Instead, he altered heading subtly, creating the appearance of lateral withdrawal. The high escort pair followed, descending slightly to maintain visual dominance. The flanking elements compressed inward. The margin narrowed. Any sudden dive now would intersect at least 2 converging fighters. He waited. At approximately 3 miles from Dinjan, the bomber formation began gradual descent toward optimal bombing altitude. This change reduced their speed margin slightly, but increased vulnerability during transition. Adair committed to a shallow dive, aimed not at the lead bomber, but at the second element in formation. The escorts responded instantly. 4 Oscars rolled, inward from separate vectors. Their coordination was disciplined. They did not cluster. They staggered altitude, preventing a single extension escape route. Adair fired briefly at the second bomber element. Hits were uncertain. Defensive gunners responded more quickly this time. Tracers crossed his forward canopy arc. A strike landed along the right wing route. The aircraft shuddered. He passed beneath the formation again. This time the escorts did not hesitate. 2 Oscars followed directly. 2 more angled from above, cutting off his climb vector. The lower trailing element accelerated to block low-level extension. The Japanese were no longer reacting. They were shaping. Adair pushed into a dive steeper than the first. Airspeed increased rapidly. The P-40N held steady. The pursuing Oscars followed longer than before, testing structural limits. 1 peeled away late. The other remained. Adair leveled just above treetop height, then initiated a rolling extension rather than a straight climb. The maneuver preserved lateral unpredictability but sacrificed some altitude gain. The pursuing Oscar attempted a tighter roll to stay inside his arc. It nearly succeeded. Nearly was enough. Adair applied rudder and slight throttle reduction, inducing a minor overshoot without dramatic banking. The Oscar crossed high and forward. A brief burst from the P-40 intersected the crossing path. The Japanese fighter broke off abruptly, smoke visible but not heavy. Adair did not confirm damage. He had lost altitude, and the bombers were closer to release range. His second pass had produced limited visible disruption. Escort cohesion had strengthened. Defensive fire had intensified. The enemy had corrected its spacing error from the first engagement. Dinjan's runway was now within realistic bombing distance. Adair's fuel state remained workable, but ammunition was declining. Structural integrity was uncertain. The wing root hit could not be inspected in flight. Control responsiveness felt intact for the moment. The margin for error had narrowed significantly. A third pass would not benefit from surprise or loose escort positioning. The Japanese now anticipated diving attacks and had arranged vertical traps accordingly. Any misjudgment in angle or timing would result in multi-directional engagement. Adair did not increase aggression. He widened his orbit slightly, forcing the escort screen to stretch if they wished to maintain coverage. The bombers maintained course. Their discipline was intact. The risk calculation had shifted. This was no longer about isolated strikes. It was about preventing synchronized bomb release. If the formation maintained cohesion for another few minutes, Dinjan would absorb the full weight of 24 medium bombers. Adair's aircraft had already taken damage. The Japanese had adapted, and the next engagement would determine whether disruption remained possible, or whether the airfield would face the full formation intact. He turned again toward the bombers. By the third engagement cycle, the initiative had shifted. The Japanese no longer treated the P-40 as a nuisance. They treated it as a variable requiring elimination. The escort screen widened deliberately, inviting another diving attack while concealing convergence points at staggered altitudes. It was a bait formation. Adair recognized it. If he repeated earlier vectors, he would be compressed between climbing fighters and descending elements. The bombers would continue unimpeded. He altered the pattern. Instead of diving toward the bombers, he climbed visibly, slower than optimal, exposing himself just enough to draw pursuit. Two Oscars reacted immediately, climbing to intercept. A third adjusted laterally to block what appeared to be his extension route. He continued climbing. This was not a pursuit of altitude dominance. It was misdirection. By appearing to prioritize height, he encouraged the escort to redistribute upward, thinning the lower, protective layer around the bombers. The bombers maintained course. At approximately 4,000 feet, Adair rolled slightly away from the formation as if disengaging. The high escorts committed further, accelerating to close the distance before he could reset. Then he reversed. A half roll and immediate nose drop converted altitude into speed. The maneuver was precise, not dramatic. The high escorts, having extended upward aggressively, now required additional seconds to reverse their own vector. Seconds were the currency. Adair's dive aimed not at the lead bomber, but at the inner edge of the formation, between elements where escort coverage had thinned during vertical redistribution. Defensive fire opened earlier this time. Tracers crossed his forward arc before he reached effective firing distance. A burst struck the left fuselage panel. Another impact rattled the canopy frame. He held the line. Short, controlled fire intersected the left engine of a Ki-21 in the central cluster. The engine erupted into sustained smoke almost immediately. The bomber began losing alignment, descending slightly. The formation wavered. But the escorts were no longer slow to respond. 4 Oscars descended from multiple angles. 2 from above and right, 1 from low rear, 1 from left flank. Their geometry was deliberate. Escape corridors narrowed. Adair passed beneath the bombers and began a shallow dive to build separation. The trailing Oscar matched him aggressively, pushing into a dive that approached structural tolerance for the lighter airframe. Adair increased dive angle. The P-40N's heavier construction allowed higher dive speeds before control compression. He knew the numbers from stateside study, but dive tolerance did not eliminate vulnerability. Recovery altitude was finite. The pursuing Oscar hesitated, not immediately, but perceptibly. Adair leveled just above 1,500 feet, preserving a slim margin before treetops. The Oscar that had followed longest broke upward to avoid overextension. Another remained in pursuit, but with reduced closure. Adair initiated a slight climbing turn, not tight enough to bleed excessive speed, not wide enough to signal retreat. The trailing Oscar committed to a tighter inside arc. That was the mistake. The P-40's heavier nose required calculated rudder coordination. Adair applied it precisely, reducing bank angle mid-turn and allowing the Oscar to overshoot high and forward by a narrow margin. It was not theatrical, it was mechanical. He fired once. The burst was brief and measured. The Oscar's fuselage flashed, then began shedding smoke in thicker volume than previous engagements. The fighter rolled away and descended sharply. There was no time to observe outcome. 2 additional Oscars were now closing from opposite quadrants. The dual phase had matured into encirclement. Adair extended again, but the bombers were approaching final approach distance for release. The smoke-trailing Ki-21 was lagging visibly now, pulling the formation slightly uneven. Escorts compressed around the remaining aligned bombers, creating a dense defensive sphere. The Japanese had learned quickly. Their bait tactic had nearly succeeded. Their vertical traps had nearly closed. They were now coordinating to eliminate the single interceptor entirely before bomb release. Adair's ammunition was no longer full. Fuel was declining. Structural integrity had absorbed multiple strikes. Control responsiveness remained stable, but degraded airframes often fail without warning. Timing pressure intensified. If he disengaged now, the bombers would release unchallenged. If he pressed further, escort density would ensure sustained fire exposure. He chose neither extreme. Instead, he positioned himself between the bombers and Dinjan again, forcing them to either alter course or fly directly through his firing arc. The escorts adjusted, attempting to push him downward and away from intercept geometry. For several seconds, the sky compressed into intersecting vectors, none clean, none stable. Then defensive fire from a bomber connected solidly along his right wing. The aircraft jolted sharply. Control input felt uneven. The duel was no longer theoretical, and the next exchange would not allow gradual correction. The strike along the right wing changed the equation. Adair felt the imbalance immediately. The aircraft no longer responded symmetrically to input. There was resistance in the lateral control. Not failure, but interference. He did not roll instinctively to test it. That would have revealed weakness to the escorts already repositioning above him. Instead, he stabilized his attitude and reduced throttle slightly, just enough to appear as if damage had slowed him. The Japanese reacted exactly as expected. 2 Oscars descended aggressively, reading his reduced speed as vulnerability. A third widened left to cut off extension. The remaining escorts compressed inward, forming a tightening sphere around the Chase bomber core. This was the trap. Force the damaged aircraft into defensive maneuvering. Collapse vertically. Destroy it before it can interfere again. Adair did not accelerate away. He did not climb abruptly. He allowed the first descending Oscar to close distance, closer than was comfortable, closer than he had previously permitted. The second followed slightly higher, offset to bracket. If he attempted an immediate escape dive, both would track and compress his margin further. If he turned hard, the damaged right control would fail under stress. He chose neither. He held steady. The bombers, meanwhile, had adjusted their descent profile. They were nearing optimal release altitude. The escort density above them had increased, thinning only in the lower rear quadrant, the area considered least vulnerable after previous passes. Adair's earlier attack pattern had conditioned them. They now anticipated high or lateral vectors. He altered that expectation. Instead of diving steeply or climbing for position, he drifted laterally beneath the outer escort arc, maintaining a shallow trajectory that appeared defensive rather than offensive. The descending Oscars mirrored him, believing containment sufficient. He waited for separation between the 2 pursuing fighters. At the precise moment when their spacing widened, one slightly ahead, the other slightly above, he executed a restrained maneuver, a subtle throttle increase combined with a controlled rudder-assisted bank to the left. Not sharp, not obvious. The leading Oscar adjusted too late. The trailing Oscar overcorrected. Their geometry conflicted. For a fraction of a second, their arcs converged dangerously close. Neither collided, but both were forced to widen to avoid it. That widening created a corridor. Adair converted the brief opening into forward speed, angling not at the bomber's nose but at the weakened segment, still lagging from earlier damage. The Japanese had redistributed escort strength upward and forward to counter his previous vertical entries. The lower inner flank now held fewer fighters than before. He did not fire immediately. Closing distance under defensive gun arcs required restraint. Firing too early would waste ammunition and signal alignment. He allowed the bomber's left engine nacelle to fill more of his sight picture before pressing the trigger. The burst was short and deliberate. The damaged Ki-21's engine flared visibly. This time, the smoke thickened into sustained flame. The aircraft dropped from formation decisively, forcing adjacent bombers to alter spacing. Spacing errors cascade. One bomber banked slightly to avoid collision. Another corrected late. The formation compressed unevenly. The escorts above recognized the disruption too slowly. Adair did not remain to confirm destruction. He dropped beneath the destabilized element and continued forward, placing himself directly between the main bomber body and Dinjan's runway grid. The Japanese plan had depended on eliminating him before release altitude. Instead, his refusal to rush had exploited their redistribution. He had not attempted to outturn superior aircraft. He had not relied on aggressive dives alone. He had allowed the escort screen to shape itself around expectations he created, then attacked where density thinned. The remaining bombers now faced a dilemma: maintain rigid formation and risk further stagger, or break alignment to avoid collision and sacrifice synchronized release. The escorts reacted urgently, descending in greater numbers than before. The sphere tightened again, but now around a formation already destabilized. Adair checked his instruments. Ammunition was reduced significantly. Fuel margin narrowing. Control response on the right remained imperfect, sluggish but intact. He did not pursue fleeing fighters. He maintained position. The intellectual climax was not in destruction. It was in forcing hesitation. And hesitation had been introduced. The bombers adjusted course slightly, minor but measurable, while re-establishing formation coherence. That adjustment cost time. Time moved the formation closer to Dinjan, but also closer to losing optimal bombing alignment. The escorts descended again, more aggressively now. They would not allow a fourth structured disruption, and Adair's margin for controlled flight was narrowing faster than before. The next strike did not glance off. Defensive fire from the bomber cluster intersected the P-40's right side with visible impact. The aircraft lurched violently. A sharp snap traveled through the fuselage. The right aileron jammed. Adair applied lateral input. The response was delayed, then uneven. A second adjustment produced no corrective roll at all. Control cables had been severed. The nose dipped abruptly. Altitude, just under 2,000 feet. The aircraft entered an accelerating dive. Not steep at first, then steeper as asymmetry increased. Airspeed climbed. The right wing dragged. Luke field training had covered this scenario clearly. Damaged controls, immediate bailout. He did not reach for the canopy release. Instead, he reduced throttle, not fully, just enough to decrease torque stress. He applied rudder pressure opposite the roll tendency. The aircraft resisted, then responded marginally. The dive continued. Below him, uneven terrain, tree line, scattered structures beyond the airfield perimeter. Above him, 40 escort fighters descending. No wingman, no ground fire support reaching this altitude. Ammunition nearly exhausted. The bombers were seconds from optimal release distance. Adair trimmed nose up cautiously. Too much and the aircraft would stall asymmetrically. Too little and the dive would steepen beyond recovery. He adjusted in increments: rudder, trim, Throttle modulation. The aircraft shuddered violently at 1,500 feet. He did not overcorrect. At 1,200 feet, the descent rate slowed slightly. At 1,000 feet, the nose stabilized enough to level gradually, still imbalanced, still pulling right, but controllable. The escorts hesitated. They had anticipated a bailout. A damaged aircraft in uncontrolled descent is typically abandoned. Instead, the P-40 leveled just above treetop height and continued forward, directly between the bombers and the runway grid. The bombers could not release safely with a hostile fighter in their immediate forward arc. They adjusted. The formation broke. Not dramatically, but sufficiently. Several bombers veered off intended alignment to avoid collision risk and low-altitude interference. Release timing fractured. Bombs fell scattered, some short, some wide of primary targets. Runway sections remained intact. Fuel storage was missed. The escorts descended in anger, but altitude and speed had collapsed into a low-level scramble, unsuited to coordinated interception. Adair did not pursue. He maintained course long enough to ensure the formation passed, and release was incomplete. Then he extended southward at minimal controllable speed. He did not eject. He flew the damaged aircraft back toward Dinjan. The landing was recorded as heavy but stable. Maintenance crews counted 16 visible hits. Right control linkage destroyed. Additional structural stress fractures along the wing. He reported events without embellishment. No mention of doctrine violated. No commentary on risk taken. Just sequence, altitude, engagement notes. The squadron log that day reflected disrupted bombing, limited infrastructure damage. One P-40 severely damaged but recovered. Recognition followed quietly. There was no ceremony on the tarmac. No immediate citation read aloud. But the next rotation schedule placed his name differently, less as reserve, more as intercept lead. Nothing public shifted, but something operational did. On December 13th, 1943, one pilot refused a parachute when the manual required it, and forced 64 aircraft to reconsider their approach. When the moment comes and doctrine says abandon the machine, do you trust the manual or your understanding of how it really flies?